Zainab Usman is a senior fellow and director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's joining us from Washington, D.C. One of the headlines out of the early headlines out of this G20 is that it seems poised to add a new member, the African Union, the AU. It looks like, barring a late veto, the G20 will soon be known as the G21. What would that change?
Thanks for having me. Very good question. What would change if the African Union were to be admitted into the G20 is that it would certainly give the group more global representation and more global legitimacy. We have to remember that this was a group that was formed shortly after the global financial crisis, when it became clear that there are emerging markets like China, India, Brazil, etc., growing at a very fast rate, which were not members of the G7 at the time. So the G20 was convened. But very soon, it became clear that a huge part of the world was excluded from the G20. That is the African continent, except for South Africa, right, which currently is just about 60 million people and about just a little over 6% of the African continent's population. So including the African Union in the G20 will give it more broad-based representation and global legitimacy.
Right. So for a reminder for our viewers, the G20 is 19 countries plus the EU, a regional body, and they might add this other regional body, well, it's a continental body, the AU, which would therefore speak in the name of or for the 55 countries of the African continent. How would you think they might influence or help shape the conversation in a way that helps African interests?
Having the African Union in the G20 would certainly go a long way in making a lot of Africans feel that they have a voice in decision-making around global economic governance. But for that to happen, even if the African Union is admitted within the next couple of hours or the next couple of days, to be able to harness this opportunity, the African Union itself needs to do certain things. First of all, it needs to be able to put forward certain common Africa positions on key issues that affect African economies, whether it's the just energy transition as the world moves towards a low-carbon future, or consensus from African countries around global trade. We have a very turbulent global trade environment, and a number of other areas like that. Then also thinking about the mechanism through which the African Union is going to be physically engaging and participating in the G20. Who is going to represent the African Union? Is it the chairperson? And who will participate on behalf of the African Union in the technical working groups, the ministers of finance that tend to meet just before the G20 summit? Things like that really need to be worked out by the African Union to be able to harness the opportunity of joining the G20.
I was wondering, when I saw this news, I connected dots with other news this week that about the Africa Climate Summit that just wrapped up in Kenya, during which African leaders called for a new global tax to help fund green energy transition in Africa. Do you think that propositions like that, big, bold, new propositions that emanate from Africa, could be discussed at the global table at the G20? And do you think they'd have a bigger chance of success with the AU at the G20?
Absolutely. I think that is a good starting point. What happened with the Africa Climate Summit? Certain ideas were put forward by the African countries that participated in the summit. Certainly, that was not a common Africa position, but it is meant to provide the element of producing a common Africa position. There are certain institutional things that also need to happen within the African Union. So I want to give you an example with the European Union, which is also a member of the G20. Unlike the African Union, the European Union is a supranational entity. It can actually take decisions on behalf of all of the 27 member states of the EU, whereas the African Union can make declarations on behalf of African countries but cannot take decisions on their behalf. But a good starting point is what happened with the Africa Climate Summit, where African countries can be able to agree on certain things and start to produce consensus on key topics. And of course, then present them to the G20 and bring the weight of 55 countries to that forum of decision making.
All right, Zainab Usman, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. And just as a reminder to our viewers, we're not there yet. The AU hasn't been officially admitted into the G20, but it looks like that's going to happen. So we'll be looking out for that probably tomorrow. Thank you very much, Zainab.